Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the official Oscarina nomination coverage for Loom. Loom is a point-and-click adventure game developed and published by LucasFilm Games. It was released in January of 1990. My name is Corbett, and I'll be your host for the evening. Joining me is fellow Oscarina voter Randi. Randi, thank you for being here.
It's great to be here and help out tonight, Corey.
Loom tells the story of Bobbin Threadbare, a youth living in what is known as the Weaver's Guild. Bobbin's destiny has been kept from him by the guild elders, but when his mentor Hetchel protests to this, the elders attempt to banish her from the community. It is at this time that a mysterious swan emerges and transforms the elders into swans. This sends Bobbin on a quest to discover the secrets of his purpose by traveling to the other guilds across the world. It is up for 10 awards, including Best Pixel for 1990, Best Direction, Best Gameplay, Discovery and Expression, Best Art Design, Best Interface, Best Visual Immersion, Best Female Character for Lady Cygna, Best Female Character for Hetchel, Best Male Character for Bobbin Threadbare, and Best Narrative Composition. And just as a quick little aside, I will say that, in general with these game awards, a certain amount of these games had a bit of pedigree, and coming into it, I was sort of getting to see what all the hubbub was about. But, as someone who is not a point-and-click adventure veteran, Loom was one that I had heard so little about and was, quite frankly, very pleasantly surprised by how much it had to offer, as evidenced by the large number of categories.
Just that I had actually played a lot of these games, more modern ones, and I even hadn't heard much about Loom, and it kind of blew me away. I was really surprised at the quality and the interesting storytelling this game had to offer.
Yeah, for sure. That this game will hopefully get at least a little more spotlight than it currently possesses, because, we do think that it's got some special attributes that are worth recognizing.
It deserves a lot more recognition than it has gotten.
For sure. Alrighty, so, starting things off, I'd like to talk about Best Art Direction. So, in general, Loom's visuals are very beautiful. In particular, the character close-ups and the background art. Some highlights for me include the up-close portraits of Chaos and Rusty's ghost, which are real spooky. We've got the background art of the first screen, which is emphasized by Bobbin walking through the landscape. And a third example that I think is particularly cool is the swans in the space pond. You'll understand once you, listen to the story as far as the context of it making sense.
Get there.
Yeah.
It's hard to miss.
Yeah. But in general, though, it's just a very well laid out and, interesting scene. One that, I honestly might put on a t-shirt someday because, it's got a very iconic, image to it. So yeah. What about you, Randy? Do you have any particular visuals you remember from the game being especially cool?
Just that the pixel art in general is extremely high quality and beautiful, specifically in any of the up-close kind of facial portraits we get of certain characters at certain points, which isn't a lot, because a lot of the people in this society keep themselves hooded and masked. Also the dragon.
Yeah, the dragon is quite pretty, and good pixel art there. Definitely gives off strong vibes of her personality. So
for sure, that's what I was gonna say. It shows off her personality great.
Yep. Yeah, on the topic of the pixel art being quite beautiful, the artwork ends up looking so good in part due to a technique called dithering, whereby two different colors are overlapped with different pixels being adjacent to each other. This provides the illusion of colors that are in between the two overlapping colors. This was actually made possible by Lucasfilms creating compression algorithms themselves, which allowed for dithering to be used without taking too much space. It also helps that all the background art was done by Mark Ferrari, who is one of the industry's best at this pixel art dithering technique. Mark Ferrari's pixel art dithering techniques would actually go on to be used in Monkey Island, as well as other LucasArts games. So, it definitely had some impact there as far as the style is concerned.
Gorgeous, and I say this as someone who loves good pixel art.
Yep, same here. I am I must be upfront about that bias, I suppose, because, I mean, even nowadays, pixel art is good, and, I mean, mind you, nowadays, the standards for pixel art is pretty high, because, I mean, a lot of the indie games in the pixel art community are quite, talented, but games like Loom still stand up even in comparison.
Actually blows some even modern ones out of the water with how much it could do with the limited technology.
Mm-hmm. In addition to the pixel art in the backgrounds and the foregrounds and the character portraits, Loom also features a very excellent cover art piece by Mark Ferrari, the same one who did the backgrounds and so forth. Definitely gives you very, mysterious and interesting vibes seeing those hands, the threads between them, making you wonder, like, what the heck is a video game gonna be about? That it's just got a picture of, threads being woven with all this fancy magic stuff.
Mm-hmm. It definitely gets you curious and thinking about this is going to be something different than you've seen before. And it is. I've never seen a game like this.
Aside from just looking pretty, I think that the art style also helps to convey the fantasy world building that, really has a strong atmosphere to it, as well as the dark fairy tale feelings that are associated with Loom. You'll sort of understand that more as we, get on further in the story and whatnot, but it definitely does more than just look pretty. It kind of helps to convey what the story is going for as well, in my opinion.
Oh, for sure.
Aside from the things I mentioned previously, the last thing I want to touch on for the art direction would be the manual. So, the manual happens to have a portion of it that contains the same book of patterns that Bobbin Threadbare carries during his journey. And inside this book of patterns, there are illustrations which are made in a medieval guild art style that definitely conjures the feelings of the 1500s flat perspective, elaborate murals that, are frequently adorning museums. This definitely helps to feel immersed in the era, but also make you feel like, this manual is like a real document that people like Bobbin would have been using.
Go on to say it's gorgeous and it adds so much lore and world building in it, and that for me is above and beyond. And
okay, so anything else you want to contribute for best art direction before we move on, Randy?
Just that I think this game has a very iconic and unique art style and art direction, and it does all of it very well in my opinion.
So Loom's primary interface is simple and consists of only a few elements. We have the top 2/3 of the screen, which allows Bobbin to walk around the world and select objects. We have the square in the bottom right of the screen, which shows you which object that Bobbin has selected and allows you to examine the object by clicking on it. And then, in the bottom third of the screen, we have the distaff, which allows you to input melodies in order to cast spells on the selected object. The distaff will also light up in different positions when a magical note is played in the environment, so that the user can write down what the melody is and replicate it elsewhere in the world to repeat a spell that he heard elsewhere. So I would say that this interface definitely works to its advantage in a few goals. I would say that it improves immersion since you are operating on the same object that Bobbin is operating on. You're just, pushing the notes on the staff, and that's sort of similar to what Bobbin would be doing. I would also say that the advantage of this minimalistic interface is that it ends up being fairly simple, despite the fact that there's a reasonably large number of spells that you acquire throughout the game. In total, there are 16 that Bobbin can learn, and there's 26 if you count the ability to reverse certain melodies in order to create an alternate version of the spell. Despite this large number of spells, the distaff is, pretty simple to interface with. You just click at different parts of the staff. The only difference as you progress the game is that more notes on the distaff become available, which allow you to cast a larger variety of spells. The advantage of having the distaff be laid out such that the different sections of the staff will glow based on what note there is it allows non-musical people to still grasp how to play the music by indicating via note and distaff whenever a note is played. It also limits the complexity of puzzles for players to maintain the intended, easier experience. So, just as a little bit of background, Brian Moriarty, the head creator behind this, he was frustrated by the fact that a lot of different adventure games were not getting finished by their players, and he really wanted to create a cinematic narrative sort of centric experience, and he thought that, that wasn't going to fly very well if people are just not going to finish their games. So he did do a lot of steps, simple interface included, to try and make sure that people could actually finish their game, which is nice.
I want to point out that Loom is actually really interesting and innovative for its time, in that it really cares about you finishing the game. And that was a very valid fear in this era, because a lot of games, because of so-called moon logic, as we now call it, were really unintuitive and really easy to get soft locked to the point where you would have to restart the entire game to make progress again. And this creator really wanted to avoid that with Loom. And I think he did a fantastic job.
This isn't moon logic. This is Loom logic.
And it's better. Woo!
But yeah, I'll go into that a bit more in detail when we talk about direction. But, that vision of wanting to create a more simple experience that would actually, be able to be completed was also reverberated in the interface here. You only pick the object you're going to interact with and pick which spell you're going to use on it, as opposed to things like Monkey Island, where you'd have a really large inventory and all of them could be combined with each other and combined with all sorts of, interactions, and, it ends up being a lot more complicated compared to Loom. So, yeah, moving on, I would say that the control scheme of you pushing the different segments of the staff for different notes, that reinforces the musical theme that the game is going for. You cast spells with notes, and you find melodies throughout the world from, different objects and stuff. And it keeps the focus on the environment that Bobbin is in. So yeah, it ends up helping with the musical theme that the game is going for. In addition, I would say that having the interface interactions be pretty minimal and kept to the bottom of the screen means that your eyes are going to be mostly drawn to the top 2/3 of the screen, which is Bobbin and his environment. As a result, the focus is definitely more on the environment that Bobbin is in, which, again, helps to improve the immersion and feel less video gamey. And I would also say that, having your main tool for the interface be the distaff helps to emphasize the most important element of the story, which is Bobbin's acquisition of spell powers and how that affects him as a person as well as the world at large. So, gets bonus points for that as well.
Yeah, I would say we really do see a growth in the character as he gains knowledge and gains spells, and it does change him. And he learns new responsibility with each new power, it feels like.
Yep. And, you can definitely see that emphasized in the fact that you got this big old honking distaff taking up a lot of your screen that, you're going to be thinking about it significantly the same way Bobbin is.
For sure.
Also, just as a minor bonus point in the interface direction, so the primary way that you'd be interfacing with this nowadays would be with a mouse clicking around the screen, but they actually took care to make sure that the entire game was actually completely playable with keyboard, because at the time that this game came out, a lot of people didn't have a mouse. So it's also a nice, accessibility option for, people who had older style PCs and couldn't control things with a mouse.
It's so crazy to me, like now. As much as a mouse and keyboard will sometimes give me trouble, I can't imagine not even having the option.
Yeah. People were probably a lot more patient with their technology not cooperating back then. I mean, not too long before this, they were dealing with the era of punch cards, which, oh boy, then my parents will tell you how much of a pain in the neck that was.
Interesting times.
Yep. So, just to mention a couple of cons to the best interface element of Loom. So, mostly, if you're using like a point-and-click interface, you're going to be just clicking around the, map and clicking on the distaff. However, Loom does still use the F1, F2, F3 keys to perform setting changes and save and load. In my opinion, I think that the interface could have been improved if they also added an option to perform these changes using only the mouse via providing a menu drop-down and clicking the corner and stuff like that. I just would, help keep the interface nice and simple for, introductory adventure gamers, I would say.
Yeah, that would make some sense.
Also, I would mention that, while the interface does work very well with the musical theme that the game is going for, Unfortunately, this theme does not work quite as well as the thread weaving theme that the game originally was going for.
Mm-hmm.
So, given the Guild of Weavers and whatnot, Brian Moriarty originally was planning on having the user draw different patterns using their mouse, which would end up causing the different spells to be cast. However, as mentioned earlier, a lot of players didn't have mice, and so they decided to nix this in favor of the musical motif because it would allow people to use the keyboard to control it as well. So, it still ends up being pretty cool, but probably could have been cooler if they had actually still kept the pattern drawing element of it.
Yeah, the musical element did seem a little out of place to me personally at first, especially after the audio drama and learning about the lore behind the scenes. I'm like, wait, why is this music and not looming, weaving, thread, something like that? At the same time, if this game ever is in consideration for a remake, I would love to see how they would implement that now.
Oh yeah, definitely. I guess, it sort of strikes me as something that would be kind of difficult because, I don't know if you've ever tried
Yeah.
drawing with a mouse, but it's not very elegant, and so you're going to have a very generous pattern recognition method and whatnot.
Oh,
But,
or you're missing the obvious solution. This would be a touchscreen phone game.
yeah, that would be pretty interesting. But yeah, I personally think that, while the musical theme doesn't work as well as the weaving element is, I just have a soft spot for, music in general as a, important part of the human experience, and, getting to see that turned into like a magical thing, even if it doesn't the best fit, I think it still does sort of evoke a lot of, magical feelings for me, but that's more of a subjective thing. I can get why it wouldn't vibe as well for other people and whatnot.
Still liked it. I didn't think it was bad. It just felt a little out of tone.
Yeah. Agreed. Okay, well, moving on. The next category we have is Best Visual Immersion. So, on the topic of Best Visual Immersion, I would say that the manual and the interface both contribute to visual immersion. I previously talked about it, but, the manual has the whole, you flipping through your book of patterns to, like, learn about the spells that you're weaving, but in addition to just reading up about your spells in the Book of Patterns, it actually ends up becoming an essential gameplay element because as you're learning these spells, you're actually told specifically by the game manual that you should write them down in the Book of Patterns, just like Bobbin would as he's writing down his own spells. So you're basically getting to play the part of Bobbin there as far as, getting your spells out and so forth. So, in addition to the manual interface helping out with visual immersion, I would also say that Bobbin, he's not just a static character as far as having his portrait be of fixed size and only moving from left to right across the screen. Instead, Bobbin usually weaves in and out of the scenery depending on what world he is present in. The paths that he traverses can be winding, and the distances from you, the player, can be short or long, causing his character portrait to shrink or grow larger. I would say that, this little detail, to me at least, helps the worlds feel real and not as video gamey.
Yeah, it definitely brings them to life, I would say. And it uses perspective really well to help you kind of see what you should focus on and what you shouldn't. Most of the time.
Yeah, I would say so and whatnot. You've got that introductory screen, for example, where, you've got that little leaf sticking out that shows you, hey, this is something that you can examine, tutorialize you on that. And you also have the really brilliant, night sky available. And so you're going to probably want to click on that at some point to, see what all that's about. And that ends up also being important to solving a puzzle later on in that zone. So,
yep. So it does a really good job of signposting you there with kind of just where objects are placed in the world.
So, also on the topic of visual immersion, I would say that each guild feels very distinct from one another, and the many details within the world are consistent with the guild that they belong to, from the type of buildings that are present to the type of gravestones that are used and the type of outfits that are used. It helps the places to feel real and immersive, in my opinion. So, another point I wanted to make, and the final point I have on best visual immersion, is that in general, I would say that the backgrounds are vibrant and detailed. They're filled with clouds, distant hills, and trees, worthy of being painting backgrounds. They also fit the mood and setting of the story with the respective guild. And I would say that in general, this helps because they hired on, Mark Ferrari, who happens to be very talented with pixel art, also happens to just be a talented artist, just regular, aside from his pixel art. I mean, I've seen some of his stuff outside of Loom, and it is very impressive in my opinion. So he definitely channeled some of that energy with making these very pretty backgrounds for Loom.
Oh wow, that's really good to know. I haven't seen a lot of his work outside of it, and now I'm kind of curious to check it out.
So the next category we have is Best Gameplay for Discovery and Expression. So the visual immersion I was previously mentioned tends to also help with discovery because, if you feel very immersed in Bobbin's shoes, then you're going to want to explore the same way that he wants to explore, so that's kind of handy. Aside from that, Loom, similar to Monkey Island, employs the LucasArts design philosophy, which involves no death or unwinnable states. And I mean, since Loom came out before Monkey Island, and a lot of prior LucasArts games did have frequent death or unwinnable states, at least from what I can tell, it seems like Loom is the first one that really employed this design philosophy. Although, I have not confirmed that with 100% certainty, so grains of salt there. In general, though, having this philosophy encourages exploration and experimentation because players know that they won't be heavily punished for failure. So they'll just try stuff to see what will happen, and the manual flat out will tell you this design philosophy in advance. So players will know that they're not going to die and they're not going to get soft locked by poking around. So it gives players a chance to really try their luck a little more and do things that they might not do if they were worried about the consequences.
For sure, especially with how common getting the soft lock was in this style of game.
Mm-hmm. So another thing that the game does well in terms of discovery and expression is that the game includes what the manual terms curiosities, which are interactable objects that are affected when spells are cast on them, even though they are not required to continue the story. And the manual outright tells the players to be on the lookout for these and interact with them when you can, just for the sake of, seeing what will happen.
Personally love those elements. They're basically the little secrets of this game. Just things you can do for fun and to get a cool interaction, and it makes the world feel so alive and just like there's interesting things around every corner.
Another topic that sort of helps to facilitate good discovery and expression is the world building that the game provides. So Bobbin travels through a variety of fantastical worlds that have a lot of imagination and thought put into the lore. It helps the game feel like you're on a journey of exploration through real, lived-in locations, when all these locations have their own religions and cultures and ways of living and, interactions, relations with other cultures and so forth. It just really helps each different guild that you encounter to feel like reward for getting to the next area, since you get to see all the ins and outs of this beautiful world building.
Oh yeah, it very much does. They each have a very distinct visual style and elements and culture in a way that isn't just like how they talk, but just how everything is laid out.
Yeah, definitely. So the last thing I want to mention on the topic of best gameplay for discovery and expression is that the game is not only, you the player wanting to explore. The game has Bobbin himself going on a journey to unfamiliar lands with spells he doesn't yet understand. Since this matches the experience that you the player are having so closely, it definitely helps facilitate you getting to feel like an inexperienced explorer who's also trying out these spells for the first time and seeing what will happen. So I would say that the narrative setup for Bobbin's exploration also helps the players to have a good discovery, type of experience.
It does. It sets the player up as kind of a parallel protagonist. Because I would say Bobbin, even though he had a lot of his experiences mirror the player, he's not just like a self-insert in the way that a lot of games at this time had. He has his own personality and distinct worldview.
Yeah, I agree. And I will definitely be talking about that more in our next section, which is Best Direction. So, direction, as defined by Mitch, is talking about the ways that the gameplay and the presentation synergize with the narrative, where they can sort of build off of each other and help each of them, become better by the presence of the other. On the first topic of best direction, we have the manual, which I've sort of hinted at earlier, but yeah, in general, I would say that the manual is just a great method of conveying story to the player and making that story very engaging for the player to read through, because it's something that they're going to have to look at anyways for the sake of writing them down. It's got all these pretty pictures to along with the lore, so you're going to want to pay attention to them and see what they are. And in addition, the manual doesn't just operate as a method of writing down your spells. The manual also functions as a hint system for the game. And the manual will flat out tell you as such. It says, hey, if you're getting stuck, try looking at the Book of Patterns. The reason why this ends up acting as a help function for you is it tells you the sorts of types of things that Bobbin will be able to do during the game. So if you're in a situation which is like, for example, you're in the dark and you can't see anything, you'll look through this manual and you'll see, oh, hey, look, there's a spell for night vision. And it makes you think, hey, I wonder where I can find some night vision. Oh, look, there's these owls that are existing inside of the level. Maybe if I do something with them, it'll help me figure out the scenario. Or alternatively, it'll just sort of give you some hints on, okay, well, here's a spell I learned, but what does it actually mean? Like, for example, if you'd come across those owls and you hadn't, realized the connection with the darkness, you'd just be like, oh, okay, well, there's a spell that owls taught me, but I don't really know what that is. I wonder what the spell, if there's anything that matches that in the Book of Patterns. Oh, look, there's night vision. Okay, well then I can probably make that connection and keep track of that as a viable option for me. And in addition to that, this hint system ends up not just giving away the game, because the hint system has maybe like half or a third of the spells are ones you'll actually learn in the game, and then the other half are spells that are just to help with the world building and the lore and to act as misdirection for the gameplay's perspective. So,
little red herrings, but ones that actually build upon the world in a meaningful way, and that is just gorgeous. Such a brilliant idea.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't mind, games nowadays taking pointers in that level and whatnot, of being able to weave the story into a gameplay mechanic so well like that. So, pretty neat stuff.
Oh, I have a game for you later then.
Okay, good to know. Loom is also noteworthy because it happens to have a well-told audio drama to convey the introduction to its narrative. So this audio drama is well done. It's got voice actors hired from BBC, and it's got sound effects and music in the background. But the reason why I consider this an aspect of best direction is that by moving this 30 minutes or so of narrative onto the audio drama, it allows space on the CD to be reserved for all of the elaborate visuals and soundtrack and interactions that you're going to be performing with it. So this made it so that they had much more leeway to, go crazy with the dithering and the backgrounds and things like that, because of the fact that, 30 minutes of its introductory narrative gets moved on to a, well-told CD. And aside from that, it's also just, nice for variety's sake, that you get to, plug into this, like, audio CD. It's sort of like, you're uncovering this mystery and trying to learn all the ins and outs of things and whatnot.
And I want to point out that there was a push for multimedia stuff in gaming at the time. Not a huge one, but it was an actual trend of, oh, the game has this, it has this, it has this. You can use all of your different media devices to engage in it.
Oh, really?
Which is kind of a blessing and a curse when it comes to preservation's sake, because sometimes we'll get stuff where there's not a lot left of that audio drama or book insert or whatever else. Unfortunately, I think the audio drama, as much as I loved it, it was probably one of my favorite parts of this work of art, but it's also technically not the game. And so that makes it kind of in a nebulous space for us in terms of Game Awards.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's up to Mitch and the voters to decide, but in my opinion, I consider this to be, like, part of the game because of the fact that, like, the manual instructs you to listen to it as, the introduction for it and things like that, in the same way that, like, a lot of these old games will expect you to read the instruction manual or else you were completely screwed and whatnot, like, I mean, it does still count as a knock against it, but like in those cases where like they're explicitly telling you have to read the instruction manual before you start, I sort of treat that as part of the game experience, but that's just more of a personal thing. Other people may not agree necessarily.
Personally, I'm inclined to agree with you. It's just, I recognize not everyone might, but it definitely sounds like it's part of the intended experience. So if you play Loom without the audio drama, you are missing out on fantastic world building and context. So please listen to it.
Yeah, and actually that does bring me, as a brief aside, to a con about, direction, but also narrative, is the fact that, like, modern iterations of Loom, as far as ports and so forth, do not ship with the audio drama, nor give you any direction that that's what you're supposed to do, which, I mean, yeah, it pains me so much, because I've literally listened to, video reviews of the game, and they're like, what the hell is going on? It doesn't make any sense, and I'm just like, no, they don't know. But yeah, so, I mean, that's more of a problem with later ports than it is the original, which did include the audio drama, but just, word to the wise for all of our listeners, if you're playing Loom, listen to the audio drama first. You can find it on YouTube and other places.
And personally, the context is definitely needed. This is a fantasy world that is kind of unfamiliar to most people, I would say. It does its own thing.
Yep, you can't just rely on, you got your elves, you got your dwarves, etc.
No.
They try and really, do their own thing as far as, spinning all these different magical guilds with their own cultures and religions and stuff. So,
fighting.
Yep.
Drama.
Mm-hmm. So another aspect of best direction would be what I mentioned earlier about the difficulty. So the difficulty on Loom is, on the whole, fairly easy, because Brian Moriarty wanted this to be a game that people would finish and be able to, enjoy the storytelling. So this is nice because it allows the flow of storytelling to be more continuous and less interrupted by major difficulty roadblocks. So it's a nice aspect for direction, but, as we'll get into later, it does sort of maybe take away from its ability to really give you a satisfying level of challenge and achievement. There is still some degree of that, but not quite to the same extent as, say, Monkey Island, which is very full of puzzles.
Say the backwards segment. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but that was a challenge for us.
Yeah.
Do you remember how dumb we felt?
Yeah.
It was also really cool when we inevitably looked it up and then did it. It was like, wow, that was really an interesting solution. One we were too dumb for, but really interesting.
Yep, and that is another thing about Loom, in particular Loom's manual, that really helps it stand out from a direction standpoint, and to a certain extent a difficulty standpoint as well, is the manual will flat out tell the users how to order a hint book or how to call the LucasFilm helpline. So if at any point the hints from the hint book are not sufficient, you can always just call up the hint helpline and they will get you unstuck to better facilitate you actually reaching the end of your games.
I suspect it will no longer work anymore, but the fact that they had that at launch, amazing. And super cool.
Mm-hmm. So aside from the easy difficulty, another thing about Loom, which helps in its narrative delivery but then hurts it in other ways, is the fact that it is a relatively short game. So Loom in its FM Towns version, which is a bit longer, is maybe about like 3.5 or 4 hours long, whereas a lot of the other games that we've been reviewing, they're more along the lines of the 7 to 8 hour range, or in the case of like Final Fantasy IV, that's like 26 hours. But the advantage of short length when it comes to storytelling is that it makes it more likely for the user to actually finish the game in its entirety. I feel like Brian Moriarty, he's trying to go for that experience, and, as we'll see, if users had just finished the first half of the Loom game, they really wouldn't be getting the full picture of what Brian Moriarty was trying to convey through his story. So I can definitely see the advantages of keeping it short, though at the same time it means that, the world doesn't get as fleshed out as it could have been.
Well, there's another advantage too, though. It's not just that everyone will finish it, it's that it's a tighter narrative as well. Loom doesn't really yank you around in, dumb, offbeat directions that don't really make sense other than to stick you with another puzzle. It moves forward pretty well once it gets going. Yeah. And that's something that's really nice and made for a really standout and cohesive experience when playing it. Even though it took us much longer, I think, than that time to beat it because we got stuck and we're, exploring every little nook and cranny.
Yeah, well, it also took us longer because we're also talking about the game, and also I'm just slow at completing games in general because, I am a person who likes to explore all the nooks and crannies and so forth, so yeah.
I am too. That's why we make a good team.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So yeah, I would say that I agree with Randy what you said about the short length making for a tighter narrative. I mean, I don't think that there were really any points in the narrative where I was particularly bored and I felt like they were just wasting my time and yanking my chain with stuff. It definitely seemed like, they were going for something throughout most of the runtime. So that was definitely a plus.
It's a plus, and I think that's a rarity of games of this era as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them were really trying to pad length and get you the bang for your buck, and this game says, no, I'm going to stand on my own merits.
Yeah, definitely. So another aspect that contributes to Loom's direction is how story is often conveyed through examined objects, dialogue with people, and overheard conversations while you explore the world. Because they're not just hitting you with a giant wall of text, it means that gamers are going to be a lot more engaged, because they're going to be, hearing about the story while they're, fixing puzzles and just poking themselves around. This also helps the lore to sink into your brain a lot more, because you're going to have pretty visuals and music to accompany the lore being conveyed, because, you'll be hearing something about the world that you're entering, while you're also hit with the big old, background and buildings and so forth that let you know about what it is that you're hearing about. Similarly, aside from allowing the gameplay to enhance the narrative this way, I would also say that having story bits be intermingled with the objects and people of the world also allows the narrative to improve the exploration gameplay, because it means that every time that you're, checking things out, you might have a chance to hear a bit of extra lore or world building or some just interesting interaction. And I would also say that, all these little bits of interesting lore being hidden everywhere helps to break up the puzzles so that the experience stays fresh and varied, so that you're not just going to be, locked into fix the next puzzle, go to the next objective, fix the next puzzle, go to the next objective. In between there, you're actually getting interesting little thought-provoking and, evocative bits of lore and stuff.
And I love that about this game. But there is, unfortunately, a little bit of a downside to that, is that because there's such deep and interactive lore behind all of these items, it means that it's something that's very missable for a lot of people. These are things you don't have to interact with. It's just if you want to play around with it and learn more, which is a blessing and a curse. Some players will love that because they don't need to get bogged down by lore they don't care about. And other players will be like, well, why is this here? Oh, okay. And just move on.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I mean, I think that, some of the best bits of story building, people who I was watching on YouTube didn't end up even getting to hear because, for example, they didn't examine the dragon, so they didn't get to hear the dragon give her own little, rants about her love life and stuff like that, which, I mean, I was very much a fan of.
Hilarious!
But yeah, totally. And yet other people may have missed out on it. And, I mean, maybe it was intentional. Maybe they're just like, oh, okay, I want to get on the next area. But I suspect, at least for some, it was unintentional because, they were just thinking that, they had to fix the next puzzle and they didn't realize that they'd have this entertaining bit of dialogue.
Right, and that makes sense to me, especially because a lot of times in other games of this kind, there weren't cool things like that. It's something that Loom does distinctly and does it so well.
Mm-hmm, definitely. So the last bit that I wanted to mention in the form of direction is that once a turning point in the game is reached, the earlier versions of the game have some very noteworthy on-screen blood and decapitation that occurs, which really drives home the severity of the situation that Bobbin finds himself in. And in my opinion, that counts for direction because that's definitely a visual element that's just completely in your face and undeniably affecting, the, stakes involved with your narrative and whatnot. So I think that was also a very cool element of the direction. And mind you, this is an element that was toned down with later releases, like the CD-ROM release. In my opinion, your best bet would be the FM Towns version, because that's got the improved visual fidelity, but it's also got the, uncensored violence and so forth that helps the story beats to be a little more emotionally compelling, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the game really benefits from the inclusion of those elements. It is a very bright looking game, but actually kind of a story with some darker elements sometimes.
for the next little bit, I have to say, this sort of affects both narrative and direction. I have a point to say about direction, but I really can't get at it without basically summarizing the narrative. And I will give you the very, very short version of it, but I feel like it is necessary. So,
No, that's okay with me.
Yep, for any people who are listening that don't want to have the plot spoiled, they may want to fast forward a few minutes. So, the world of Loom is one that is ruled by magical guilds. The Guild of Magical Weavers ceased contact with the outside world, leading to inbreeding, which led to their guild slowly dying off due to so many babies dying. Cygna decides to use forbidden magic to create her son, Bobbin Threadbare, out of the magical loom. However, doing so seems to cause the world to start coming to an end. Through various circumstances, Bobbin is left to explore the world on his own without the guidance of his guild. He becomes more and more powerful, but in part because he lacks guidance, he ends up causing the apocalyptic threat of chaos to come into the world, leading to much death and destruction. Bobbin and the Weavers manage to limit Chaos's power, save themselves along with half the universe, which they plan to recreate without the forces of evil present. My main point that requires this summary as background is that Loom in the gameplay tries to immerse you in the character of Bobbin as much as possible in order to highlight the similarities, but also the differences in how the player thinks versus how Bobbin thinks. Because, as Randy mentioned, he is his own character with his own thoughts and his own feelings on the situation.
Yeah, he is. It's part of what I really like about him, and he's an interesting person, legitimately.
Yep. So, just to draw your attention a bit more to the ways in which the game strings you along in this respect. You and Bobbin are both wandering to try and find Bobbin's other guild members. You and Bobbin are trying out spells in order to become more powerful and solve obstacles. You and Bobbin end up causing some terrible unintentional side effects as a result of trying these spells. You and Bobbin both frantically try to undo the damage with only partial success. But then, the place where you and Bobbin may start to differ is how Bobbin sees the blame for the situation. So Bobbin, who has incomplete knowledge of the situation and the world at large, blames himself and considers himself completely at fault for all of the things happening in the story. You, the player, may take issue with that because you see how much Bobbin is a good person and how he was, for the most part, trying to do things that were only natural given the circumstances. So, by interrogating the ways in which Bobbin is wrong, the player starts to realize the messages and meanings of the game, and how Bobbin relates to the world as a whole. Bobbin does end up wreaking some major havoc, but to a certain extent, that's because the Weavers weren't around to guide him. Why are the Weavers not around to guide him? Well, this is because they were paranoid about Bobbin, and they wanted to use him as a scapegoat for all of the grim portents of the end of the world that they saw. Why is the world coming to an end? Well, those are caused because the guild was too insular, unbudging, and lacking in empathy to help facilitate Cygna having her own child. Cygna could have easily just married with somebody outside of the guild were it not for their rules that were forbidding marriage, as explained in the audio drama. And even if they weren't going to go outside the guild, they could have potentially helped Cygna to have a more healthy child with less transgressive and forbidden magic. If they had been a bit more willing to facilitate this, Cygna may have had a childbirth in a more natural fashion, and it would not have caused the thread to be introduced to the loom, which was seemingly the cause of all this end-of-the-world business.
I'd also like to highlight that there is definitely some both capitalistic and religious elements at play, overtones in this, and that the guild used to be very brutal and cutthroat and warring with all the others until it isolated itself. And then once they did, they got to a point where they worshipped basically the threads of fate so much that they were refusing to almost do anything or make any changes. Which
yeah, definitely.
Is very much shown to be toxic and hurting everyone in the story.
Yeah, I mean, even aside from Cygna, Cygna tries to point out to the guild that, like, hey guys, your inbreeding is literally going to bring this guild to an end, and all of the work of our ancestors will be for nothing. And they're still like, yeah, we know, but will the pattern, so whatever, just...
Yeah, it's basically strictly adhering to a dogma, even to the point of ridiculousness, because they believe it's so hard. Blind faith is said to be a bad thing, so to speak, in this.
Yeah, there's definitely heavy religious undertones with all the guild, but especially with the
Mhm.
Weavers, and you get to see how it affects their outlook and their actions in ways that have major negative consequences.
For sure.
While questioning Bobbin's motives does illuminate the themes and the messages of the game, which is basically, all the ways that, like, having these very constrained worldviews cause problems for people and the world at large, seeing how Bobbin is wrong and how you as the player can understand that, but Bobbin cannot, only makes Bobbin's self-blame all the more tragic. It's only natural
Mhm.
for Bobbin to blame himself because he lacks the context that would have helped him to understand the reasons that he isn't entirely at fault. And this goes to show how people who are victims of their circumstance often turn to self blame because they lack that broader context, which isn't always available to them. So, it's tragic and it's also thought provoking, because it's like, yeah, that I can see why he would think that. I mean, it's wrong and, it's causing a lot of needless pain, but I mean, what else can he do given the circumstance?
Yeah. It really makes you feel for him and empathize with him. It's that he just seems like such a lost kid that's doing his best and honestly, most of the time doing a good job and cleaning up his mistakes pretty well. But it's just not enough because he doesn't understand everything.
Yeah, definitely. That's about it for what I had for direction. So, leading us into the purely narrative composition territory. So, on the topic of narrative, as previously mentioned in the direction segment, Loom has very good world building. It's interesting, it's evocative, and it's unique. And it sort of carries the feeling of there being magic in all sorts of unintuitive places, especially considering the Guild of the Weavers itself. I mean, having magic imbued with their looms and thread, I just think that's a really cool motif, and ripe for all sorts of, neat world building and whatnot.
It totally is, and it's very evocative of kind of that Greek storytelling, that woman weaving fate kind of thing. I like it.
Yep, definitely. It's also kind of cool because each of the guilds have philosophies and religion, but you can kind of trace them back to just them taking their crafts like way too seriously and then having that bleed into like every element of their lives. You can definitely see how, okay, yeah, well, we got this guild of glassmakers. Well, what if people took glassmaking really, really seriously in all aspects of their lives? Well, it turns out that they value clarity above all things, so they end up having like future vision, and they end up, actually sacrificing themselves to try and promote their vision of clarity and things like that. And it's just really interesting seeing all the ways that, their craft and their religion and their outlook end up all intermingling with each other.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's very much these ideologies taken to extreme in every one of their societies, but it's very well done. It doesn't seem silly. It seems very real.
For sure. I would also say that, one of the things that Loom has going for it is this dark fairy tale atmosphere. So this sort of comes down to a matter of taste, but I mean, for me, I think that dark fairy tales are really cool. And this game, does not pull its punches, in my opinion. It faces very real threats of death and the end of the world, and that helps the conflicts to have stakes, which gets the player invested. I mean, in other video games where you think that, well, victory is inevitable and, everything's going to go hunky-dory, it's harder to really, want things to, succeed and be on the edge of your seat figuring out if they will or not. But, like, from the very get-go of Bobbin's adventure, his grandma comes over and tells him that, hey, guess what? The end of the world is coming. We can't do anything to stop it. I guess we can run or we can just accept it, but yeah, I don't know. And hey, I guess you're gonna go find our guild now without any of us guiding you. Okay, bye. So I mean,
Right?
And that's a lot.
You're born now, buddy. But you were an adult. Oh well. End of the world.
Yep.
It's a mood. It's a mood.
Yeah, and this is on his 17th birthday, mind you, and so this is just a lot to take in for someone, of that age who's relatively sheltered and stuff. But it definitely sets an idea from the get-go that, like, hey guys, this is actually a pretty, grim portents for this storytelling as far as there's going to be some, potential real threats that are not going to be easily done away with and whatnot. So I really like that about the game, personally. So another aspect of the best narrative would be the characters of Loom. In my opinion, they are well written, and among all of this elaborate and, somewhat dense world building, I would say that having these well-written characters acts as emotional anchors to make sure that even when, you're parsing through lots of bits of lore to try and make sense of things, you still have a lot of investment in what's going on, and, you're compelled to keep going because you care about these characters and you want to see them succeed and see what happens to them.
Oh, for sure. Even the characters that are antagonists, and by this I mean mostly the older guild people, not so much chaos. Like, you can see where they're coming from, even though you think they're wrong.
Yeah, definitely.
They're interesting people. They're fleshed out people, and that's really cool to see.
Ha ha ha! Fleshed out. Ha ha ha!
Ah.
Yeah. If you've played Loom, you know what we're referring to there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I would agree with you. I think that even the minor side characters that make up the guild, they all are presented in ways where, you can understand where they're coming from, and it sort of helps to sell the world building because, they are empathizable characters that are living out the visions of their guilds, in a way that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one character even almost kind of steals the show for a little bit. He was really interesting, and then I think you told me that he was going to be the protagonist for the second game, but that never happened.
Yeah, Rusty from the Guild of Blacksmiths. He ends up coming in for a few scenes, and you get to have some interesting interactions with him. And that was actually designed to be set up because the planned second game of the planned trilogy, which sadly never came to be, would feature Rusty as the main character. So, nice little bit of weaving the connection between the first game of the trilogy and the second one.
Weaving.
Yep.
Legitimately, if there was ever a Kickstarter to make the other two games, I think we would both be part of it.
Yep, for sure.
If you're listening, creator of Loom, we're here. We support you.
Yep. So yeah, the characters I would say are quite nice. As previously alluded to, I think that the plot of Loom is one that's very thought-provoking, and it makes you think about how people act under difficult circumstances, and also how societies and people both shape each other in, various interesting ways.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I think every character in this story is so drastically influenced by the society they've grown up in, and to the point where it changes how they think, how they interact with others, what they consider moral or immoral. It's something that's really inescapable for all of them, and it's really interesting to look at and see these kind of distorted mirrors of different parts of our own society.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Just to briefly recap the points that I mentioned in the direction, I think that the game being, shorter allows it to have a tightly wound narrative, and I also think that the audio drama is very well done, featuring talented BBC voice actors, background music, and sound effects. And lastly, when it comes to narrative composition, the manual, once again, is pretty excellent in this regard. So each one of the spells has a brief little paragraph that describes the history of that spell, how it was used and how it's still used today, and how it actually ends up
not used anymore for whatever reason.
Yes, there are some spells in there that you do not learn, and you learn why you do not learn them, is that they ended up causing really bad problems for the guild. So yeah, you should definitely read up on those if you get the chance. But yeah, and the thing is that each of these short little paragraphs and whatnot, they're very concise, such that, you really want to read through them all, because, it's jam-packed full of interesting tidbits, and sometimes humorous ones as well. But because they give you all this little bitty lore associated with the spell, it sort of gives a bit more gravitas to when you're, performing these. It's not just a parlor trick. This is, actually an important part of the guild's history, and it was part of how they managed to make a living and how they related with other guilds and so forth. So, really impressive narrative composition, even when it comes to the manual, I would say.
For sure.
So those are most of the primary pros as far as the narrative is concerned. On the con side, as briefly alluded to before, the story is a bit short, partially because it was intended to be a trilogy, partially because Brian Moriarty wanted people to finish this game, but part of the problems of that is that, the world and characters don't get explored as much as they could have been. And also previously alluded to, later versions of Loom also added censorship, and they even trimmed the length of the dialogue in order to allow for voice acting. But in my opinion, that's for the detriment.
They did what? They trimmed the dialogue?
Yeah, so the CD-ROM version, to try and flex their technological skills, they had voice acting for the in-game parts, which is nice, but then they had to cut the dialogue in half, which is very not so nice.
Yeah, I can't imagine that working. Yeah. If you were to add voice acting, you'd have to take nothing else away, to be honest.
Yeah, and keep in mind, this is a short game to begin with. So
right.
To do it the travesty of making it even shorter, it's like they're cutting out some really valuable content at that point.
Oh, yeah, I imagine so. That's... odd decision.
Yeah. So definitely if you play it, make sure you play the FM Towns version. And then also, as previously alluded to, the fact that later versions, mostly modern, so not really too relevant to the Game Awards, didn't include the audio drama, so if you play it, make sure you listen to the audio drama first. And yeah, that's about all I had to say about narrative composition. Anything else you want to mention, Randy, before we move on?
Just that I think it's a very tightly woven narrative, and it's very cohesive, it's very good, it sets up for a trilogy quite well, but while also feeling relatively complete on its own, except for the ending where that is definitely... hey, here's a problem for the next protagonist to solve.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. I mean, I personally found the ending sort of satisfying, but yeah, you and many other people, it was kind of a cliffhanger too, so, I can see why that would also be a problem for certain folks as far as, helping it to be a nicely contained story.
For once, I actually didn't really mind that it was a cliffhanger. I was just frustrated in the fact that I want more, which is a good thing. It's not like it felt cheap. It felt like, oh wow, when's the next one? Oh, there's not. Huh. Sad.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's a cliffhanger, but it's not exclusively a sequel bait cliffhanger. In the sense that, it's still evocative and interesting on its own, even if it wasn't setting up for a sequel, but it just so happens to also set up for a sequel.
Right. It does feel like most of Bobbin's arc is completed, and that, perhaps if there was a third game, it would be him and Rusty teaming up or something. Or with a new third person, they all work together. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or it could have been just, no, Bobbin created this problem, he had his character growth, and now everyone else has to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I could see that being valid, too.
Right.
Alright, so speaking of Bobbin, I think that provides us with a nice segue into our next category, which is Bobbin Threadbare being nominated for Best Male Character. So, as far as some of the traits that I think make Bobbin a good best male character, first and foremost, I would say that Bobbin is very nice. So, there's one segment in the introductory level where you open up an oyster and merely for the sake of allowing seagulls to eat it and have a nice breakfast, and then you have the option when they're eating this oyster to close it, and your morbid curiosity might compel you to do so, but when you do...
Yours did.
Mine did, yes. But when you do, this is one of the few times where Bobbin will actually stop you, and he just says, oh, I don't want to ruin his breakfast. So, it's too out of character for Bobbin to do. He's too nice of a person to hurt the little seagull for the sake of trying out his little magic parlor tricks. So, nice little bit of characterization there while you're poking around.
Yeah, it immediately sets him up as somebody who won't do everything you ask if it's something that he doesn't feel comfortable with, or that he can legitimately foresee immediately hurting somebody.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. He's a kind person.
Mm-hmm. Another quality that makes Bobbin endearing is the fact that he is kind of clumsy. When he's first being taught how to spellcast by Hetchel, his grandma raising figure, he screws it up and he ends up breaking the window and almost revealing them to everybody else and whatnot. But hey, that's what happens when, you're a kid who's just learning how to do magic and whatnot. It's just, part of life. But that sort of, helps him feel a bit more relatable because, oh, whoops, I ended up doing the dumb thing. I would also say that Bobbin is trusting and innocent. So when Cygna, his mother, reveals that she is actually his mother, Bobbin, without skipping a beat, just yells at her that she's a liar because he did not want to doubt all the things that Hetchel and the rest of the guild had told him, But at this point, the guild has shown themselves to be highly morally suspect, as well as, not necessarily the most truthful because they've been keeping plenty of things hidden from him. So the fact that despite all that, he's still willing to just trust them all and just, stick to what he's known. It might be that he's just clinging to whatever sense of, security and comfort he has, but in my opinion, it also shows that he's got a certain amount of, innocent trust still left in him, even despite all the things that have happened.
Oh, for sure. And I think it is natural to cling to what you know. Not to mention, at least initially, Cygna can't really prove any of that. She just sows in him that seed of doubt.
Yeah, she can't prove it, but the fact that, he immediately just declares her to be a liar rather than being like, oh, yeah, maybe all the people I talked to were just totally making their stuff up and whatnot, it definitely shows that he's, clinging on to that very strongly and not wanting to, entertain all these other more disquieting ideas.
Of course. I think that's what most people raised in a dogmatic society or situation would do, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. Another admirable quality of Bobbin is that he takes time to remember his mom despite never having met her. He alludes at one point, when he's talking to Cygna, that he visits his gravestone, the gravestone of his mother, every day. That's a level of devotion you wouldn't see amongst most people, but, I guess it kind of sadly shows how, he's trying to cling to this idea of a person who cared about him and was nice to him when so much of the rest of the guild isn't and stuff. And, that's kind of sad, but also pretty endearing that he's willing to show that kind of devotion.
Yeah, it is. It's very, to me, it reads as really tragic for him because he's building up this mother that loved him so much and cared about him that doesn't really exist. We the viewers, the player, knows that Cygna does care about him and what she did, with the lengths she went to create him. But Bobbin's never known any of that. He's just known Hetchel, which, while she does take really pretty good care of him, it's still very limited by what the guild allowed.
Yeah, definitely. So another aspect that makes Bobbin admirable is the fact that he's willing to risk his life to save his guild and his loved ones, despite things overall going pretty badly for him in that respect. So, the point at which this is most strongly showed is the fact that, when Chaos is trying to weave his final grim portents and, become ruler of the world as we know it, he offers to give Bobbin a seat at his right hand and co-rule with him over the rest of the world. But Bobbin, without hesitation, tells him, "Over my dead body," and Chaos responds very evilly with, "Noted," which is pretty excellent. But yeah, the fact that Bobbin's in this situation that's way over his head and he's just still, not even willing to entertain the idea in terms of, despite the fact that the world as a whole has not been particularly kind to him and whatnot, is pretty admirable in my opinion.
Not particularly kind is an understatement. The boy has been ostracized and treated like evil since birth.
Yep, definitely. I would say that the fact that he's been treated that way since birth, the fact that he's willing to risk their lives for him, I would say it goes even beyond that in the sense that Bobbin has a surprising lack of malice considering everything that's happened. So Hetchel,
really does.
Yeah, so Hetchel early on in the game flat out tells him that the reason why the elders wanted to turn him into a swan is because they fear him for something that is not his fault. And yet, he doesn't react with anger towards the elders. He's just more confused and trying to understand and, recalibrate himself with all this. But, lots of other people would hear that, and they would just be really upset with the fact that the elders are doing this to him completely unjustly. And yet, Bobbin, is still willing to protect them despite all that and, doesn't seem to show any outward hatred towards him. So, really goes to show that he doesn't deserve all the baloney that the guild is throwing towards him.
Bobbin is a very accepting person. He just kind of accepts his lot in life very, very easily and tries to do his best with it.
Yep. So I would say that the last point I wanted to bring up about Bobbin is that, and probably the most defining characteristic of Bobbin, is the fact that he is very sympathetic. So he is shunned, feared, and mocked from a young age for factors that are outside of his control. This is most evident by the fact that the elders, when they are about to, be turned into swans and leave the island, they say to each other, "This is the work of the demon boy," and "Kill it while you still can, Atropos." Not even willing to call him human. It's pretty awful. So, yeah, it leads to the boy feeling isolated. After this happens, Bobbin comes out into the open and he says, "Why do they always leave me behind?" Somebody who, seems like they're always on the other side of everything else in society.
Which is just heartbreaking.
For sure. And I mean, the unfortunate parts for Bobbin keep coming. So, at the age of 17, he's faced with a seemingly unstoppable apocalyptic threat to deal with all on his own. He's confused over a lot of things that he doesn't know, but you, the player, does, as alluded to earlier. Blames himself for the events of the story, and, wants to save a poor dying sheep, but he can't because he's not powerful enough. That was very much a bit of a, oof moment for poor little Bobbin. And probably the worst part of all of them is the fact that he has his nice grandma almost murdered multiple times right in front of his eyes, man. Like, holy crap, this poor boy.
He's got a rough life. He really does. And it's interesting because despite all of this game doesn't feel depressing or tragic to play. It's actually pretty funny and bright in most parts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, some of that owes to the, fairy tale aesthetic, because, I mean, a lot of those, grim fairy tales just had, like, the most awful tragedies, and just like, well, guess we're gonna move on. Yep, that's just the thing that happens. But I don't know, though. I think that a part of it is also the fact that, you end up getting to experience the events of this story through this, innocent and wonderful child Bobbin, as well as his, very kind mother and grandmother and stuff like that, and it sort of gets to show, as a contrast to all the fricked up stuff that happens in the world, there are still good people trying to do good things, and, even amidst all the messed up stuff, there's still, like, moments of hope, and, it's not all bad, even if a lot of it is bad, basically, is kind of what the game's going for, I feel, in terms of the vibe.
Yeah, I think you're correct there.
Yeah. And the thing that's really cool about Bobbin, being so sympathetic and getting the, rough end of the storytelling stick, is that feeling bad for Bobbin's suffering leads to the player questioning the world he was raised in, and in doing so, ponder the meaning involved in the story. See the direction section for details. So, Bobbin goes beyond just being a, interesting and charming person that, you'd want to, experience the game through, but he also ends up conveying a lot of the meaning of the story, through his little arc and his experiences and stuff, which is quite nice.
He does.
So, moving on to our next character, we have Lady Cygna, who's the best female character. And I mean, we've been kind of sprinkling spoilers throughout the whole rest of this thing, but like, Lady Cygna's whole deal is just total spoilers, because I mean, that's what the whole audio drama's about, so, you've been warned, just letting you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, I would say that the most defining characteristic of Lady Cygna is she embodies the protective mother. In the course of the audio drama, she's upset that her previous child and many others died. And I mean, the BBC actress really sells it, but she's coming to the elders pleading, how many more babies must die before the guild must earn your condolences? So, yeah, that definitely, gave her a strong introduction there.
It's absolutely heart-wrenching, just what she and everyone else has gone through, and this is just normal and expected and something they're supposed to deal with, and they're clearly not okay.
Yeah. And so, beyond just being upset about the situation, for the sake of bringing a healthy child into the world, she chastises her elders, she rebels against their rules, she sacrifices her belonging and humanity, knowing full well that doing this is going to get her exiled and turned into a swan.
Swan.
Yep.
Yeah, that's the thing they do in this setting. They don't like what you did, you're a swan now. Forever. Yep. Bye.
Yep. And she risks interacting with a loom that nobody understands very well anymore, and she knows could have negative consequences, but she's willing to push through all those barriers for the sake of bringing a healthy child into the world. So definitely bringing out that strong, protective mother instinct there.
I wouldn't even say just protective mother, but that is there. But it's also this this idea, she wants things to not grow or to not stagnate. She wants things to be able to grow and be born again. And she personally wants that, to be able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, when the guild questions her motives, if she's doing it for herself or her guild, she says both, you know? And I mean,
yeah.
I think that makes her... Yep, definitely. And yeah, aside from... That's all the things that she does just to bring a healthy child into the world. But then, when her child's humanity gets threatened, she's willing to turn the whole freaking rest of the island into swans. And then, for the sake of visiting her child, to spend time with him every year and see that he's okay, she visits him every year, once a year, even though that's kind of bending the rules. Well, I can't set foot on the island, but I can fly over it, you know, so, you know.
She does a flyby, legitimately.
Yep. And even at the point of exile, she's happy that she brought her baby into the world. Her quote was, "Do what you must. This baby is alive. I am content." So even when being faced with the reality of the consequences of her actions, she's fine with it because she got to live out her role as a mother. So pretty impressive stuff there. So aside from her role as a, you know, protective mother, the fact that she's willing to question authority to try and keep the guild alive and ongoing, as Randy mentioned, that's also a very positive attribute of her. I would also say that, you know, she's also sympathetic, similar to Bobbin, because of the fact that she's motivated by grief over her lost child, which, I mean, that's heartbreaking for any person to have to go through. And, you know, having to deal with that and wanting to have a healthy child, those are both admirable goals. And so you can really feel for her and the actions that she does that end up affecting the story in a lot of ways.
Yeah, very much so. It's unfortunately more common than a lot of people think it is, too.
Yep. And, you know, similar to Bobbin, you feeling bad for Cygna's suffering also makes you think about the reasons for it, and it lends meaning to the story. I mean, Cygna did end up adding this thread to the loom, which did contribute towards the end of the world, but it's like, did Cygna do the right thing? And if she didn't do the right thing, is it maybe something that could have been avoided if, for example, the loom had, you know, helped her to bring the child into the world and stuff like that, you know? I mentioned
or just anyone was able to compromise, or at least try to help.
Yeah, it really wouldn't have been that hard for them to just let the loom, or let the guild marry outside the guild, you know, and not had horrible inbreeding and stuff like that. But not the will of the pattern, apparently, so yeah, wouldn't have happened. So, yeah, let's see here. So, yeah, by questioning, you know, whether her rebellion was inevitable or not, and, you know, it sort of makes you question, you know, what kinds of things that women are, you know, gonna do when they're forced to endure the suffering of their child dying repeatedly and, you know, not being able to raise their own, which kind of makes you question, you know, this value or the justifications of their society and, you know, how much the morals are kind of messed up, all things considered.
Oh, for sure.
Yep. And she also happens to be a contender for best character because she happens to have the best quote of the game. When Cygna tries to question the elders say that they shouldn't be questioned because only the pattern may judge them. But then later on, after Cygna happens to finish bringing Bobbin into the world, the elders confront her and they're saying, "Lady Cygna, what have you done?" And Cygna bitterly and mockingly tells them, "Only the pattern may judge, Elder Atropos," which, ooh, that's some great character building right there.
Such perfect girl boss energy. She was like, no.
Yep. So yeah, that's about what I had to say for Lady Cygna. Anything else you want to add before I move on?
I just think she's such a interesting and tragic character, and she's a good part of the reason why. Watch the audio drama. Listen to that first, please, everyone.
Yes, indeed.
There's a really good YouTube video, I think, that somebody did of it.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. So
I recommend that for sure.
So you can listen to the audio drama, but somebody also did an edit of the audio drama on YouTube where they also pasted over fitting art that's from the game and the concept art, and it really does sort of help to enhance the experience by, you know, giving you pictures to go along with all the, you know, background, you know, talking and so forth that happen to be fitting and, you know, also just helping to fill you in on the world at large. So I recommend that one probably more than just listening to it. Although if you want the truly authentic experience, you could just listen to the audio drama. Your call.
Yeah, I would recommend the video as well, actually.
Alright, so next up for Best Female Character, we also have Hetchel being nominated. So Hetchel is a caring grandma character. So you'll notice that in the audio drama, she notices that Cygna is pale and her hands are trembling. She's concerned that Cygna is not yet recovered and tries to have her sit down out of concern for her well-being. She listens to Cygna's concerns and helps her to get an audience, even though this is unexpected in terms of how the elders see it.
I'd like to point out that I think Hetchel is not just a grandmotherly figure. I think that's what she is to Cygna. But I think to Bobbin, she's very much his mother figure. The closest he's had to a living parent. She is who raised him. So she kind of plays an interesting dual role of someone who is both an older adult, but also still having to raise a child.
Yeah, that's definitely very true. I mean, I think that for me, maybe matronly or some other term might have been more appropriate, because when I say grandma character, I mean the fact that, like, she manages to convey a lot of, wisdom of her years, and embodies common tropes associated with grandmas, which is, like, being caring and, nurturing and so forth,
Yeah, she does. I just thought it was important to highlight her role in the story is not just that.
Yep, for sure. So yeah, other aspects that help contribute to her caring grandmotherly nature include raising Cygna from a young age. She's willing to raise Bobbin as though it were her own child, even though it's Cygna's, and she does this without dropping a beat. Cygna asks Hetchel to care for this child as you did for me, and Hetchel's response is just, "It's the only way I know." So,
Aww.
Yeah, quite adorable.
Beautiful.
She also takes Bobbin to see his mom visit every year. She also tells Bobbin under her breath, "Happy birthday, poor boy." So, she understands all the, unfortunate aspects of his upbringing, and she feels bad for him. And she also tells Bobbin to stand away from the edge when he's being a Dumbo and, is getting himself in danger because he's too eager to look at the swan. So,
Because he's 17.
As that particular flashback, I think he was only like 10 or something like that. Yeah.
So even dumber.
Yeah, exactly. Even dumber, and caring grandma is willing to, call him out when he's being a bit of a dum-dum. So that is also nice.
Mm-hmm.
So even though Hetchel is a frail grandmotherly figure, she is still willing to rebel against the elders in order to help Bobbin. In her case, she rebels against the elders to help Bobbin channel his powers by teaching him how to perform his first spell. This is despite the fact that the elders mentioned that Hetchel has always upheld the rules to the letter. So it just goes to show how much that, her care for her child/grandchild, is significant enough that she's willing to, even go against the things that she's normally very adherent to. She does this because she wants to guide him in the use of his powers, and she feels like not doing so would be equivalent to deserting Bobbin, implying that she doesn't want him to feel isolated and alone. So, showing how she's willing to rebel, when it's necessary, even if that's not normally her typical mode of action, which is also an admirable trait.
I think she's also pretty smart, too. I think she notes that, and at least what she says to the elders at one point is that, not teaching him is probably more dangerous. So it's not only that she cares about him, it's that she's looking at this from a different perspective of, if we can't just ignore this quote-unquote problem child and act like it's going to be okay.
Yeah, because she pictures it as, hey, guess what? He's coming into his powers whether or not we help him. So maybe it would be better if we're actually providing the guidance to him so that, he's able to do it in the right way. And it's like, she's saying the thing that you're going to see firsthand throughout the game is very true and kind of guides his character arc, unfortunately. And yet nobody listens to her, unfortunately. But, she's the one speaking the truth. Which actually 100%. Guides me to my next admirable trait about Hetchel is that, along with being smart, like Randy says, Hetchel is very insightful. So, yeah. So, there's one part where she's taking Bobbin to see Cygna flying overhead, and the way that she describes it, the exchange that happens between Hetchel and her child is as follows. Hetchel says, "Still beautiful." Bobbin asks her, "Why does she sound so sad?" And Hetchel responds, "Because she is alone. Proud and alone." So, in my opinion, it's pretty amazing that she's able to get all of that, insight into Cygna's state of mind, despite the fact that she can't even talk to Cygna. She can just hear her, mournful cries as a swan, So that's one pretty good example, I would say, of how Hetchel's able to channel her insight.
I think she knows her. Like, she really understands her.
Yeah, for sure.
That comes through. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that, unlike the Elders, Hetchel is the one who's able to realize that chaos is not resulting from Bobbin, but it's just something that's going to happen at this point. And she also points out the fact that the Elders are merely engaging in wishful thinking when they're going to potentially turn Bobbin into a swan, So she's able to realize the things that even the people who are ruling the place are not and whatnot, either because they are not wise enough or because they're, blinded by fear and their own old ways of thinking.
They're very, very petty. Definitely blinded.
Yep. She's also the one who points out that, in her opinion, chaos is not stoppable, and the best that can be done is to accept it or flee. And while that does sound pretty grim, at least according to the events of the game, that does seem to be somewhat true, I mean, the Weavers end up managing to get away, but, they end up causing probably a little better than how Hetchel implies it. They're able to limit Chaos's power, and they're able to save, maybe half of the universe by fleeing along with it, But at the same time, though, Hetchel's the first one who realizes that this is not the sort of threat that you end up just, being able to beat through traditional means and stuff, which, also helps to showcase her insight.
Mm-hmm.
Aside from the traits mentioned previously, she's also helpful. There's a part where Bobbin ends up losing his distaff because he ends up getting captured by the Guild of Blacksmiths. And yet, despite the fact that she's been transformed into this, teeny little, goose baby, she rescues Bobbin from the Forge prison by bringing him his distaff, which involves flying narrowly over a fire to do so, which, is dangerous for either an old lady or a little baby goose to be doing, and yet she does it for the sake of helping Bobbin out, which is admirable.
Baby swan, Corey.
Right. Sorry, baby swan, not baby goose. Yeah.
It's easy to mix those two up.
Yep, fair enough. She's also willing to risk her life in order to try and limit the damage from Chaos, despite her age and limited power. So, I mean, when Chaos is already wreaking havoc, she also is flying around, Chaos to act as a distraction and to try and untangle the loom herself. But she's literally just a baby swan. She can't do a whole lot, but she's willing to try, and that's also pretty admirable, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And similar to Cygna and Bobbin, Hetchel also ends up helping with the storytelling because at the climax of the game, you and Bobbin end up seeing her almost murdered repeatedly, and it really elevates the emotional stakes to the highest level and keeps the player on the edge of their seat while they're trying to see if anything can be done to solve their predicament. So, So definitely for all the factors I mentioned, I think that Hetchel deserves a consideration for being voted as best female character of the Game Awards season this year. Randy, anything else you want to add on there?
No, just I agree that she's a pretty strong contender, actually.
Yep, definitely. All right, so that's all of our individual character categories. So to wrap things up, we have the Best Pixel for 1990 award. So in terms of the other categories, besides what it was nominated for, Loom is a bit weak at difficulty and achievement since it's a bit easy. I would personally say that it's pretty good at level design, and it's pretty good at audio immersion too. It's got some pretty noteworthy sound effects that stick in your brain, but just not quite good enough for a nomination because, we got a lot of competitive contenders for those. The music, I would say, is a bit of a mixed bag. While it's evocative and nice to listen to on its own, it sometimes doesn't match the tone of the scene well enough, and the lacking number of tracks means that some songs loop too many times. So it's a bit of a pros and cons thing there as far as the music is concerned. Anything else you want to mention as far as the, other categories that Loom wasn't quite nominated for, Randy?
Just that the looping track in particular really got on my nerves, even though I rather liked the song. And I did feel that the music, I agree that sometimes tonally it just felt a little weird, and it could have used more variety there.
Yeah. So, overall, Loom does very well in many artistic aspects, but it has some quirks that may affect the enjoyment for some, such as the short length, somewhat easy difficulty, and soundtrack that doesn't match the story as well as it should. If you want to enjoy a dark fairy tale journey with lots of excellent world building, and you're willing to overlook these quirks, then Loom may be deserving of the Game of the Year status.
I would say the story and the visuals are probably this game's strongest points, and to really focus on those if and weigh those against other games when choosing Best Pixel.
Yep, that is very fair. So, as far as where Loom can be played, Loom can be bought and downloaded on Steam for the measly price of $3, but the version that you end up playing on Steam is unfortunately the CD-ROM release, which is the abridged censored version that, includes voice acting. However, there's actually an online website where if you provide the website with proof that you bought the game on Steam, the website will provide you with a download of the FM Towns version that you can then play for yourself. I think that that's probably the way to go, and I think that's reasonably ethical from a legal point of view. You still end up compensating the authors, and you end up playing it on the best version of the game possible.
Yeah, that's one of the fairest ways I've seen to do that sort of thing.
So, Loom is up for 10 awards, including Best Pixel for 1990. All of the winners will be announced this October on Oscarina Saturday. Thank you, audience, for listening today, and thank you, Randy, for joining me on this discussion on Loom.
You're very welcome. I really loved this game. I found this was the hidden gem for me, I think, in this year's Game Awards. Something I didn't know about ahead of time, and so I was really glad to be able to talk about it.
Same here. And if Loom wins Best Pixel, the first winner will show that artistic expression and intuitive design can break down the boundaries of player participation.